What's up, good people? Welcome back to another Commander deck tech, this time featuring Kathril Aspect Warper. My name is Nathan. This is the Salty Productions YouTube channel. If you like this sort of content, leave a like on the video, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And I always forget to shout these out at the beginning of the video. I make companion gameplay videos for these deck techs, where I will actually goldfish between 2 and 3 times the full deck to turn 7 or 8 to see how fast we can get to a lethal board state, assuming the deck is uninterrupted. So if you want to watch one of those, I will have the link for this particular companion video down in the description below. With that out of the way, let's read the commander. Kathril Aspect Warper is a 5-mana Abzan commander, Nightmare Insect 3/3. When it ETBs, put a flying counter on any creature you control. If a creature card in your graveyard has flying, repeat this process for first strike, double strike, death touch, hexproof, indestructible, lifelink, menace, reach, trample, and vigilance. Then put a 1/1 counter on Kathril for each counter put on a creature this way. This commander is a combination of a self-mill and Voltron strategy, which is somewhat strange, and that actually attracted me to this particular commander. Now, what we want to be doing is essentially starting out the game plan with some self-mill, then we're going to be casting Kathril on turn 5, and then we're going to be playing some sort of overrun effect to either kill via commander damage or overrun with our creatures that we've built up along the way. So before we get into the individual card discussions, let me take you through some of the macro statistics for the deck. Down in the description, I have a custom mana cost advisory here because tapped out is not accurate. The average CMC of this particular deck is 3.35, and for our lands, we are running 10 tapped lands and 27 untapped lands. And there's a reason for that, because we're running a lot of surveil lands and bounce lands to help us send cards to the graveyard, which we have 7 lands that can end up putting cards into the graveyard. We'll cover the keyword analysis in a little bit. I actually have a separate Excel file where you can see that a little bit better. And then for the cost of the deck, we are clocking in at around $700 at Card Kingdom market price, or I guess this would say about $500 via TCG. If we go to Moxfield, I believe that this is actually a little bit more accurate. We have around $711 from Moxfield. So I would go with that $700 number. And the most expensive cards, if I'm not mistaken, we'll sort by market price here, would be Boseiju, which you can sub out with an Ordinary Forest, to be completely honest. Hermit Druid is pretty integral to the deck. I don't think that's very easily substitutable. Mana Confluence is about $50. You can sub this in for another land as well, and Prismatic Vista as well. So you can knock around $100, even a little bit more than that, around $200 off by subbing out these 3 lands. And then there's several cards in the $20 mark here that I won't go over. But let's jump into the category analysis here. So this is what I like to show at the beginning of each of our deck techs, to show what our game plan is and what are the odds that we will see these particular pieces of the deck in our opening hand. So in column F here, I have the number of cards that you might expect to see in an opening hand of 7 cards. And then I always assume that you'll see about 20 cards throughout the course of the game, which is essentially a result of the game's going to turn 8, and then you'll happen to draw a couple of cards along the way, which gets us to 20 cards. So with our little categories here, let me actually wall these off for you to see kind of the groupings that I have mentally here. So grouping together our land and ramp pieces, we have 42 of these, which means that we'll see 3 of these in an opening hand of 7, which is perfect, so that we can pretty much guarantee that we'll see 3 mana sources. We will see on average between 8 and 9 mana sources throughout the course of the game, which is perfect, which means that we will get to between 8 and 9 mana, and the highest cost card in this deck is actually essentially a 7-drop once you factor in all of the custom mana costs. There's some that technically cost more, but they, in their card text, they cost less based on some factor, and so they don't actually cost more than 7. So our maximum mana cost card is a 7-drop, which is perfect. So we have enough mana to fuel our end game plan. And then with our card selection self-mill category combined with our Entomb Effects, we have 16 of these cards cards in the deck, which is perfect. This is going to be our turn 1, turn 2, and turn 3 play, essentially. So we want a lot of these in the deck, meaning that we'll see on average a little bit more than 1 in an opening hand of 7, so we can hit our self-mill early on. And then throughout the course of the game, we'll see about 3 of these effects, between 3 and 4. So that's perfect. We want to essentially be filling our graveyard with a few different, cards. We don't need to go too hard on the self-mill category, but there are some cards that absolutely will self-mill you for a ton of cards, which is great. And then secondarily, we're running 10 removal pieces, which is exactly where I like to be. So we have a little bit of defense. We have 8 card advantage pieces, which is a little bit low, admittedly. However, I will say that with self-mill type of decks, your self-mill actually counts a little bit towards your card advantage number, because you can reanimate out of the graveyard, and so this is a little bit misleading. This is the number of cards that will actually get us more cards in our hand, while we can be self-milling and utilize our graveyard up with these categories up here. We have 8 overrun effects, ensuring that we hit at least 1 after we play Kathril. In fact, I have about 1.6, which I think is exactly where we want to be. We have 7 keyword creatures that we want to be putting into the graveyard. So I'll go over these cards, but a card like Zetalpa Primal Dawn is exactly the type of card we want to end up in the graveyard. We have 3 mass reanimate effects, 2 flicker pieces. So these are multifunctional. There's one card in particular that can help. Not only will it help to save Kathril in case that our commander is targeted or something like that, but we also can use a lot of different ETBs in the deck and just reuse their ETBs to get us lands or self-mill or something like that. We have 2 protection pieces and then 1 sort of generic fatty piece that I wanted to keep in, because if we granted evasion, it is a lot of damage. All right, and then our general game plan. So like I've alluded to, essentially a lot of Commander players have this notion that your turn 2 has to be reserved for ramp. And while we do have 5 ramp pieces in the deck, meaning we could potentially ramp on turn 1 or turn 2, ultimately in a self-mill type of deck, our game plan is actually to start self-milling on turn 2 and turn 3 while our opponents are ramping. We want to be casting Kathril on turn 5, essentially. Our ultimate game plan is to just continuously hit our land drops, because the more that we can self-mill in the early game, the more explosive our turn 5 is, and then our mass reanimate spells are in the late game. So turn 1, typically if we have a surveil land in our hand or a fetch land, we'll want to be fetching for a tapped surveil land so that we can start putting cards into the graveyard. There are a couple of 1-drops that we can play in the deck, but most of the time we'll be just playing that tapped surveil land. Turn 2 is going to be pretty heavy emphasis. In fact, you can see here that we have a lot of 2-drops. And so most of these self-mill cards are at the 2 mana CMC curve here. And so we want to be doing self-mill on turn 2 or an Entomb Effect to fill our graveyard with the exact creature that we want in order to power up Kathril for our turn 5 play. Or if we happen to have a ramp piece, we are happy to ramp as well. Turn 3, it's just more of the same here. So I have purposely built the deck so that a lot of our self-mill pieces are creature bodies to generate blockers. So we'll typically have creatures on turn 2, 3, and 4 to help us block. And honestly, we want to continue to self-mill on turn 3 as well, or just play a card advantage piece, given that we are probably around 4 or 5 cards at this point in time. Or we could play a 3-drop removal spell like Lorn of the Third Path or something like that to negate our opponent's early game. And then turn 4, we want to be doing more of the same there, just waiting, typically double spelling for 2 2-drops to self-mill twice on turn 4, and then turn 5 we cast Kathril. That is also dependent on who you are up against. For example, if you are suspecting a counterspell or something like that, you might want to hold Kathril for turn 6 to have some protection. Once we have Kathril on the board, we want to be casting some sort of overrun effect to essentially give it the ability to hit for more than 21 commander damage, and then also buff our entire team, so via like an overwhelming stampede type of effect. Or if we're suspecting a board wipe, we can hold up protection for our commander or our other creatures, and then by turn 7 we'll have 7 mana to cast something like Eerie Ultimatum, or perhaps another overrun, or more card advantage. So that's generally the game plan, assuming that we are uninterrupted. Lastly, in the macro category, let me just cover our number of keywords here. So let me zoom in because I know this can be a little bit small for y'all. So we have Flying, Vigilance, Trample are our 3 most common keywords here, with the most being Flying. But notably, we have a lot of Hexproof, which is important because if you combo Hexproof with Indestructible, then that makes Kathril incredibly hard to get rid of. You literally need an exile board wipe effect, like a Farewell or a Terminus or something like that. And then we also want to be casting Kathril with a double strike counter as well. So if I had to rate these, I would say that Flying, Hexproof, Double Strike, and Indestructible are really our most important. However, these are spread out intentionally so that we can theoretically hit as many +1/+1 counters on Kathril as possible. The reason why is that if we can get up to 8 keywords onto Kathril, it is a 3/3 body, so a 3/3 body plus 8 counters gives us 11 total power, and with Double Strike, that gives us up to 22 damage, assuming that Kathril can go unblocked, and so that would be a one-hit KO. All right, so let's jump into the individual card discussions here. Let me make that bigger. Okay, so let's start with our early game plan here. So let's actually just start with the ramp category because it's pretty small. So we're running, so first of all, let me just sort of provide some context that not all of these cards are optimized for mana, they're optimized for keywords. So within these types of decks, I like to build in a lot of soft synergy in order to really make the theme of the deck pop. And so every single piece that you'll see has been optimized for keywords. So Birds of Paradise, for example, is actually the best of both worlds because it's a very efficient mana dork with flying. So that's very important. We just want to be squeaking in as many keywords as we can on effects that we would like to run anyway. Milliken is going to just help us mill, just a great turn 2 play that can help us mill us throughout the game, and consistently Milliken will mill you for about 3 or 4 cards before it's like swept up in a board wipe or something like that, so I'm totally happy to run a 2 mana guy for that. Ornithopter of Paradise is inefficient at 2 mana, however it does help us tap for any color and it has flying. And Sylvan Caryatid is another one of those creatures where you normally wouldn't run this because again it's a little bit inefficient at 2 mana 0/3 defender, but it has hexproof, which is exactly why we want to have Sylvan Caryatid in the deck. And then we have a new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Tower Winder, is a 1/1 snake with reach and death touch. When ETBs, search a library and or graveyard for a card named Command Tower, reveal it and put it into your hand. If you search and then you shuffle. So the keyword here is that it searches our library and our graveyard for Command Tower, which is great because typically you'll be milling a lot, and so we want to be able to get back Command Tower if we happen to mill it. So just a great pick here as well. Then we'll jump into our card selection and self-mill. So let's start with Blanchwood Prowler. It's a 1/1 elemental for 2 mana. When it ETBs mill 3, you may put a land card from among the cards milled this way into your hand if you don't put a +1/+1 counter on Blanchwood Prowler. With the number of lands that we have in the deck here, if we actually, because I'm running 2 creatures in the land slot, so let me actually filter by type. We have 35 lands. So if we take our odds here of hitting a land with Blanchwood, we have 35 lands out of our 99 cards in our yard. And actually, you know what's interesting here? Let's change the math here because we've already drawn 7 cards, right? So our 99 cards minus our 7 opener actually are 8 because we have to draw a card on turn 1 is 91. So then if we assume that we have 2 lands in our hand, we would need to reduce our number of lands by 2, so we would have 33 lands. So if we took 33 divided by, I believe that was 91, we have let's see, and then we need to multiply that by 3. Our odds to hit is about 1 card out of those 3 cards, a little bit more than 1. So generally we will hit with a Blanchwood Prowler, but it really is pulling double duty for us by milling and sending resources to our hand. Borderland Explorer is a great pick here because what's better than self-milling is actually a targeted discard, which is why we're running things like bounce lands to play a tapped bounce land on turn 2 while you have 8 cards in hand. You can take advantage of the cleanup step to then discard a card into your graveyard. So if you have something like a Zetalpal Primal Dawn into your hand that you do want in the graveyard, you can actually, with something like a Borderland Explorer's effect, when it ETBs, each player may discard a card, and then each player who discarded a card this way may search their library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So again, pulling double duty here where we are trying to send more resources to our hand while creating a body and while discarding along the way and filling our graveyard. So just a great pick overall, and it has 3 power, which means it can trade with a lot of other 2-drops profitably. Chivalric Alliance is a 2-mana enchantment. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, draw a card, so some great built-in card advantage. But honestly, I would run this card even without that line of text, because with 2 mana, we can pay 2 mana and discard a card, so get a card into our graveyard, create a 2/2 white and blue knight creature token with Vigilance. So again, just creating more blockers, creating more creatures that we can use to help when we inevitably cast our Overwhelming Stampede, and then it will help us draw cards along the way. So just a great pick overall here with Chivalric Alliance. Cryptbreaker is a similar concept. It's a 1-drop zombie 1/1. We can pay 2 and discard a card to put a zombie creature token onto the field. And then I have yet to activate this ability, but we can tap 3 untapped zombies you control to draw a card and lose 1 life. So there technically is the ability to draw a card, but mostly we're playing it for the discard outlet while also making a creature token. Dogged Detective is a 2-mana 2/1. When it ETBs, Surveil 2, which is great. We can send up to 2 cards to our graveyard. But also, I do love Surveil in this deck because we are able to consistently hit our land drops. Again, casting Kathril on turn 5 is very important. So we want to be hitting our land drops along the way. And then importantly, the second part here is whenever an opponent draws their second card each turn, you may return Dogged Detective from your graveyard to your hand, which triggers pretty much all the time. If you happen to mill over Dogged Detective, it can go back to your hand. So I've had great success in getting this back to hand as well. Eccentric Farmer is a little bit inefficient for what it does. I would prefer if it costs 1 less mana. However, it's still good enough to be running as a 3 CMC card. It's a 2/3 human peasant. When ETBs, mill 3 cards, then you may return a land card from your graveyard to your hand. So basically just a worse Satyr Wayfinder. However, it does exactly what we want to be doing. Again, it makes a body, it mills us, and it sends lands to our hand. So again, we don't have as many of those ramp spells. However, this is counteracted by how many cards we're running that actually send lands to our hand in order to make sure we continue to hit those land drops. Fauna Shaman is one of the best discard outlets in the deck. 2-mana 2/2 Elf Shaman. We could pay 1, discard a creature card to tutor up a creature card, put it into our hand, then shuffle. I have quite often you can tutor up just whatever you need in the moment. That could be, an overrun effect if you're in the late game. That could be more card advantage, tutor up like a Dark Confidant or Esper Sentinel or something like that. It's really just whatever you need in the moment, and it's just a great, great discard outlet. Hermit Druid is a 2-mana 1/1 druid. You can pay a green and tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a basic land card. Put that card into your hand and put all other revealed cards into your graveyard. So that begs the question, how many basics are we running? We are running 2 forests, 1 plains, and 1 swamp. Now, that is so theoretically with Hermit Druid, we should be able to mill about a quarter of our deck before hitting a basic on average. However, I will also point out that there are 2 lands Prismatic Vista, and Fabled Passage that will search us up a basic as well. So my assumption is that by the time we actually cast Hermit Druid or are ready to activate it, we will probably have either one basic in our hand or on the field or maybe in the graveyard somehow. So really it's only 3 basics that we have available left in the deck, and so we'll be able to mill about a third of our deck, which is on average between 20 and 30 cards, I would wager. So this is just one of the best self-mill cards in our entire deck because it could mill us for that much in one go. Typically, you only need to activate Hermit Druid once before you're basically set to cast Kathril with all of his keywords ready. Mesmeric Orb is a 2-mana artifact. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. So the second best self-mill card in this category, in my personal opinion, Mesmeric Orb does mill our opponents. So if you're playing against another self-mill type of deck, or maybe like a Wilhout type of deck that wants cards in the graveyard, then this is not as good. However, there is the slight upside with that you can actually win via milling people out. I believe there was a Command Zone gameplay, a Game Nights video from the Command Zone where they actually won via milling out with Mesmeric Orb, just because it tends to go unnoticed. So just be aware that while this does help us mill a ton, it does mill our opponents, and it has that very slight tiny upside of potentially winning us the game via milling out our opponents. Satyr Wayfinder is a 2-mana 1/1 Satyr. When ETBs reveal the top 4 cards of your library, you may put a land card from among them into your hand, put the rest into your graveyard. So again, exactly what we're going to be doing: milling, creating a body, putting lands into our hand. Smuggler's Surprise is a new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and it is so flexible. I am more and more coming to love the spree cards because it's even better than Kicker. It's completely different effects. So it's an instant, notably it's an instant for 1 mana, and then we can choose from among 2 colorless, so a total of 3 mana, mill 4 cards. You may put up to 2 creature and or land cards from among the mill cards into your hands. So you can choose between those 2 however you want, and it mills us. So for 3 mana, we are milling, we are drawing essentially 2 cards, whatever we need out of those, if we need lands, if we need creatures, at instant speed. So that's just bananas right there on its own. I would run that just for that text. But then there's more. We can pay plus 5 mana in total. You may put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. I have Goldfish this deck where I can definitely just drop like an Endrace Forerunners in addition to an Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite, or maybe something like a Rumbleweed. So this is just absolutely amazing when you have these high cost creatures that we don't really want to cast. So something like a Sigarda Host of Herons, if it's in our hand and we don't have a discard outlet, we don't want to really pay the mana for this because we know it's not really efficient for its mana cost, but maybe we just want to drop it with something like a Smuggler's Surprise. And then we have the option to protect our creatures with the final mode here, +1 colorless. Creatures who control with power 4 greater gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So this will protect Kathril against board wipes. We can potentially hold this up with 7 mana in case somebody interacts with Kathril while its ETB is on the stack. So, or we could just do all of the above. So Smuggler's Surprise, at any point in the game, is doing what we want to be doing, which is why it is in the deck. I initially had a creature in this slot instead, just wanting to pack as many bodies as we can, but this card is just too good to not run in a self-mill type of deck. All right, so those are our largely turn 2 plays here, and then let's move on to our other Entomb effects. So similarly, if we're not self-milling, we want to be entombing. So there are a few cards here, 5 in total, that I'd like to cover. Buried Alive is a 3-mana sorcery. Tutor up 3 creature cards, put them in your graveyard, then shuffle your library. You will generally want to always grab Zetalpa, because this is the best creature card basically to have sitting in our graveyard for Kathril to get the counters off of. We also want some sort of double strike given creatures, so perhaps an Ikoria the True, or Skyhunter Skirmisher, something like that, or Aven Sunstriker. Or we also could grab Angel of Invention if we want the lifelink aspect as well. But generally with Buried Alive, what you want to grab, make sure you're grabbing, is double strike, indestructible, some sort of evasion, so flying or trample, and then you also want hexproof as well, so Sigarda as well, or there's something like if that one is in your hand or something, there's also the Slippery Bogbonder, which has hexproof that can give that as well, or even our Sylvan Caryatid there. So Buried Alive can basically just immediately grab us the best cards that we want in the graveyard. Entomb will do the same thing at instant speed, but for only one creature, so again, just pretty much going to Entomb Zetalpa almost all of the time. Gerard's Orders is a fantastic card. I have been shocked at how much work this card does. It's a 4-mana tutor up 2 creature cards and reveal them, put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So really, if you think about this, if you split up the mana cost, it's 2 mana to entomb a creature, which we're happy to do. I mean, entomb is 1 mana, but like that's totally fine. We're happy to entomb 1 creature for 2. And then you're essentially tutoring up a creature and putting it into your hand for 2 mana. So again, this will get you out of pretty much any situation that you need. Do you need an overrun? Do you need a piece of removal? Do you need some sort of card draw, Toski, something like that. We're running a total of 50 creatures in the deck, so I mean, it's just jam-packed with options there. So Gerard's Order is just a great card to cast on turn 4. Unmarked Grave, similar effect as Entomb, but it searches up a non-legendary card. So with that, we'll probably want to be grabbing. So Zetalpa is legendary, so we probably don't want that, but what we're probably going to be grabbing is a Skyhunter Skirmisher or Aven Sunstriker for the flying and double strike. Ikoria unfortunately is legendary. Sigarda unfortunately is legendary. But we do have options for Angel of Invention or Angel of Indemnity. Notably, in Angel of Indemnity, we can cast from our graveyard, which allows us to kind of draw a card by putting it in our graveyard. We get the keywords and we can cast the card later on. Vile Entomber is a 4-mana 2/2 with Death Touch. Again, optimized for keywords here. When it ETBs, search the library for a card, put that card in your graveyard, then shuffle, so we can entomb our Zetalpa and all the others. Just a great card to cast on turn 4, and it gives us that Death Touch keyword. All right, so what else? Let's just actually, because we've already been touching on it, let's touch on what are the keyword creatures we want in our graveyard. So Angel of Indemnity, kind of like I already mentioned, this is a new one from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, 6 mana 5/5, flying lifelink Angel Warrior. When it ETBs, return target permanent card with mana value 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So already just a great effect, a very Sun Titan-like effect, but without the attack trigger. But notably, what we're running it for as well, not only does it have flying and lifelink, but it has Encore. So Encore for 8, which means exile this card from your graveyard. For each opponent, create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste, sack them at the beginning of the next end step, and activate only as a sorcery. So with this, we can then get the ETB trigger 3 times, assuming that we have 3 opponents that are alive. Which means that we can reanimate 12 mana worth of stuff, which is just fantastic. In addition to having a total of 15 damage coming at our opponents in the air, combined with lifelink to gain us 15 life. So just so much packed into this card. It's pretty crazy. Angel of Invention is doing a lot of things here. So 5 mana 2/1 Angel, the stats are pretty crap. However, it has Flying Vigilance lifelink, so 3 great keywords we want on Kathril. And it has Fabricate 2, which most often we will choose to put 2 1/1 servos onto the battlefield, and then it buffs our creatures for +1/+1. This is just very efficient at what it does for 5 mana. It gives you creatures, it gives you the buffs, it gives you the keywords if it's in the graveyard. Just a great option overall. And again, it gives us that lifelink for that extra sustain. Aven Sunstriker, we're really just playing this for the keywords flying and double strike. We do not intend to ever cast this card. It is really just in here for the keywords. And you would pretty much never pay the Megamorph. I don't think I would ever do that because you're paying a total of 8 mana for a 2/2 flying double striker. So bit of a head scratcher at why that costs so much, but hey, it's Wizards, who knows. Oketra the True is a 4 mana 3/6 god, double strike, indestructible. Oketra the True can't attack or block unless you control at least 3 other creatures. We are running 50 creatures, so if we don't have at least 3 other creatures, this deck is doing something wrong. And then we can pay 4 to create a 1/1 warrior with vigilance in if we need the blocker in a pinch. Again, mostly we're running this for the keywords double strike and indestructible. Even if it were to attack, having, theoretically 6 power if you factor in the 3 with the double strike, it's not amazing. It makes for a great blocker for sure. And it has that emergency mode of creating a token, but again, we're really just having this in the deck for the double strike indestructible. Sigarda, Host of Herons is a 5 mana 5/5 angel with flying and hexproof. Spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause you to sacrifice permanents. So a little bit of a hate piece if it ends up being on the battlefield, but we're really playing it for the hexproof piece there on the card. Skyrim Skirmisher, 1/1 flying double strike. Similar conversation as Even Sunstriker. We're really just hoping to put this into the graveyard. And then Zetalpa is the best keyword creature to have in our graveyard. It's an 8 mana 4/8 with flying double strike, vigilance, trample, and indestructible. So really the 2 keywords we're looking for there are double strike and indestructible, but if we have this in our graveyard by itself, that automatically guarantees 5 keywords onto Kathril, which will put it at an 8/8, which would at least make for a 3-turn clock for the 21 commander damage. Oh, no, I'm sorry, it would be 2. It would be 2, because if it would hit for 16, then it would be a 2-turn clock. So just having Zetalpa in our graveyard is going to put a lot of pressure on our opponents if Kathril gets those keywords. Okay, so let's jump then to our removal. So with our removal, we're running 10 different pieces here. These pieces, I think, skew on the expensive side of the mana curve. And so there is that caveat, but I think that they do they make up for it in the number of keywords that are stapled onto these cards. So Aerial Extortionist is a 5 mana 4/3 bird soldier with flying. When he ETBs or deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent. For as long as the card remains exiled, its owner may cast it, so it doesn't permanently get rid of it. However, whenever a player casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. So it's a 5 mana repeatable removal spell that, well, I should say it's a repeatable temporary removal spell that helps us to draw cards. And honestly, that last bit of text there for the card draw clause will trigger just on a lot of other stuff. There's so many things in Commander that trigger off of casting from other than their hand. So Cascade, casting from your deck, casting from the graveyard if you have something like an Encore ability or something like that, which I think is a cast. Oh, it is an ability. Well, anyway, casting from exile, I mean, any sort of Prosper deck is going to trigger this like crazy. And so I also think that the temporary removal aspect of this is completely fine. It's not a big downside. Like Josh Lee Kwai has mentioned within the Command Zone podcast, they're running bounce effects more and more because Commander has gotten faster to where often just being able to remove that for 1 turn is good enough these days because the games are so quick. And so if we can even give this, if we assume that it will be cast, next turn, that is still fine in my opinion because we were able to negate the biggest threat on board. And then there's extra gravy upside if we happen to give this double strike for the double combat damage. We can potentially double the trigger when it attacks. So that's great as well. One of the new follow cards is a rather expensive 6 mana 6/6 Alpha Deathclaw with Menace and Trample. So again, optimizing for keywords there. When he ETBs or becomes monstrous For 7 mana, we can give it Monstrosity 4. Destroy target permanent. So we're packing a little bit of generic removal here. You could theoretically substitute this with something like an Assassin's Trophy if you wanted to really optimize towards the lower end of the mana curve. However, we are hoping that this ends up in our graveyard once again, and it has the ability to be very scary in the late game if we have nothing else to do with our mana. If we top deck this while we have no cards in hand, it's still fine to just cast this, destroy something, and then next turn make it monstrous for a 10/10 menace trample. That's really not that bad. But particularly it's the destroy target permanent, which I do like because we can hit lands, which we are actually running not that many effects that can target lands, and as we all know, lands in Commander keep becoming more powerful, so they just need to be able to be answered. Avid Interrupter is a fantastic new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. 3 mana 2/2 Bird Rogue with Flash Flying. When it ETBs exile target spell, it becomes plotted, which means its owner may cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost. And then spells your opponents cast from graveyards or from exile cost 2 more to cast. So just so much happening in this card. I treat this card essentially as a counterspell because if you were to exile target spell, if it's a counterspell, you permanently nuke that spell because the counterspell can only be cast as a sorcery. However, what we would probably save this for would be to hold it up for a board wipe. And if you exile a board wipe on the stack, most board wipes are expensive enough where your opponent won't be able to cast it on that same turn just because they've already spent the mana for it. Most board wipes are between 4 and 6 mana. So that essentially saves you for another turn so that you can then target the person that tried to cast the board wipe to make sure it does not become it is not casted next turn. And then we get the extra little the great text there is the last part, which is just gravy, where we're hating on spells being cast from graveyards or from exile, which again, as Commander continues over time, we see more spells being able to be cast from exile, foretell, anything with prosper or with impulse draw. So there's just a ton of effects that incidentally get hated on by this static ability. So, and it has flying. So that's just, absolutely amazing. Gemraiser is always going to be cast for its mutate cost because it has, whenever this creature mutates, destroy target artifact or enchantment and opponent controls. So we get that for 3 mana, and we get the keywords reach and trample, which are great. Glissa Sunslayer is a 3 mana 3/3 with first strike and death touch. When it deals combat damage to a player, choose one, draw a card and lose 1 life, destroy target enchantment, or remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So most of the time we're going to be drawing cards. However, this is just great incidental enchantment hate, and with a first strike death touch body, it is going to get through quite easily. Lorna of the Third Math, 3 mana 2/1 with Vigilance. When ETBs, destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. And then what I love about Lauren is that we can then tap it on a later turn to help us draw a card, and target opponent will draw a card as well to help dig for removal if we need it. Necrotal is a 4 mana 2/1 human assassin with first strike. When it ETBs, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. That creature can't be regenerated. So Necrotal is no longer efficient for what it does. I think this is mostly a staple from the old days. However, the reason why it's in here is again for that first strike ability, giving extra keywords to Kathril. It doesn't hit artifact creatures or black creatures, which is quite a big downside in my opinion. I look at this as 3/4 of a removal spell, you could say. I think it is fine for its slot. I would potentially look at replacing this with like Soul Shatter, for example, if you wanted to be more efficient mana-wise. In fact, I might even swap this out for Soul Shatter just because Soul Shatter is so good for what it does, being instant speed. which I believe is actually in the main board. We'll just show that one to y'all here. Soul Shatter, 3 mana, instant. Each opponent sacks a creature planeswalker with the highest CMC among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So basically, I view Soul Shatter as like a reverse Jeska's Will, because you're not giving yourself the mana, but you are taking away your opponent's most expensive thing, and an instant speed, which is great. However, again, with that soft synergy, we're trying to just jam as many keywords as we can, building on that synergy for Kathril. So I wanted the first strike in here as well. And it makes a body, and it can be flickered. So for that reason, it put it over the top for me instead of Soul Shatter. All right, I've adjusted the green screen settings, so hopefully we don't have as many breaks in reality here, but please bear with me, folks, as we get through the rest of this this deck. Noxious Gearhulk is a 6-mana 5/4 construct with Menace. When ETBs, you may destroy another target creature. If a creature is destroyed this way, you gain life equal to its toughness. So again, this is doing a lot of stuff here. I will say it's a little bit overcosted for just a generic destroy effect, but because it ETBs, we can flicker it, and then we gain life for some extra sustain in the late game. And again, just packing as many keywords as we can into the deck with that Menace keyword. Voracious Varmin is a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance. You can pay 1 and sack it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So this is great because we can activate this at instant speed, only holding up 1. It gives us that Vigilance keyword, which is pretty great, just packing all of that extra synergy that we can. And also, because this is on board, we can be used, it can be used politically as well, to say like, hey, you know, that giant artifact creature over there, don't send that at me or I will destroy it. Although, you know, the downside is that this effect is very visible on board, but most of the time I would think that we want to be essentially casting this for 3 mana to get the destroy effect immediately, because then this ends up in the graveyard. So we have Vigilance as our keyword in the graveyard for Kathril. Wispmare is a 3 mana 1/3 elemental with flying, but most of the time we're going to be evoking it for 1, because when it ETBs, destroy target enchantment, and then it is kind enough to put itself in the graveyard, which is exactly what we want to be doing. All right, let's go over the card advantage options here. Dark Confidant is a 2-mana 2/1. At the beginning of your upkeep, reveal a top card of your library and put that card in your hand. You lose life equal to its converted mana cost. Theoretically, you could replace this with a Black Market Connections type of effect to help ramp and draw cards. However, we are on average going to be ripping a card off the top for about 3 to 4 life. So the thing here too is I actually would rather run Dark Confidant than Black Market Connections, because it's a creature we can block with it, so that if the life loss is becoming too much for us, we can then, you know, block and have it go to the graveyard. It doesn't have any keywords, but I think it's incredibly efficient for what it does, and so that, combined with the fact that it's a body on board that can be used to pump, is just great. So then we have Esper Sentinel. It is a 1-mana 1/1 human soldier. Whenever an opponent casts a first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. This is a great card to have in the early game and draws an insane amount of cards. Notably, this can be tutored up with Ranger of Eos, which is why we are running it. And it's just an overall great card draw option that, again, we are casting a body so that we can help use it to overrun. Garruk's Harbinger is a little bit of an odd pick here. It's a 3-mana 4/3. It has hexproof from black, so that counts for Kathril's keyword ETB, because it does have the keyword hexproof. And what's great is that when it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, look at that many cards from the top of your library. You may reveal a creature card or Garruk planeswalker card from among them and put it into your hand, and the rest go on the bottom. So it can help us to draw cards if we give it trample, for example. Quite often with Kathril entering, we typically want to give Kathril flying or trample, If we already have flying in the graveyard, which again, flying is our most common keyword at about 14 effects, then we would want to give trample to something like the Garruk's Harbinger so that once it will inevitably die in combat, but we want to be able to at least replace itself with the card draw trigger there. And if we end up sending this in, it has 3 toughness, and if it dies, that is even better because then it ends up in the graveyard and can be, and the hexproof counter can go onto Kathril. So, just good card no matter what happens to this particular beast. Keen Duelist is similar to Dark Confidence, a 2-mana 2/2. At the beginning of your upkeep, you and target opponent each reveal the top card of your library. You each lose life equal to the mana value of the card revealed by the other player. You each put the card you revealed into your hand. So this one, you're going to very strategically choose which opponent, whoever needs to perhaps is behind or needs to dig for removal. This is great, and it can help just sort of speed up the game. Or if you have something like a Storm player who has a bunch of 1-mana cantrips, you can mitigate the life loss here by targeting that Storm player. Ranger of Eos is a 4-mana 3/2 and ATBs. You can tutor up to 2 creature cards with CMC 1 or less, reveal them, and put them into your hand. And for our 1-mana cards here, we have Birds of Paradise within our ramp category. We have Crypt Breaker if you need a discard outlet and have not drawn any self-mill. And then there is Esper Sentinel. We're almost always going to be getting off of Ranger of Eos no matter what. And then there is also, that's it, I suppose. So you have card draw, ramp, and then essentially a discard outlet that is available to be tutored off of Ranger of Eos. Skullwinder is a 3-mana 1/3 snake with Death Touch, again optimizing for keywords. When it ETBs, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, then choose an opponent. That player also returns a card from their graveyard to your hand. So Richard from MTG Goldfish thinks that this is the best card ever, and I kind of agree. I'm on board with the Skullwinder train because you can almost always control what cards go back to your opponent's hand. You say, hey, person with the Swords to Plowshares in their graveyard, we need to kill that big scary creature that will basically wreck the whole table. How about you return that to your hand and you cast it on your turn? So it's putting resources into your opponent's hand that you can predict, and theoretically they will use their mana to take out threats on your opponent's board that are mutually threatening. And if you can't find a relevant target for Skullwinder for an opponent to return to the graveyard, you just say, hey, you player over there, can you just return that fetch land to your hand and we'll call it a day? And they would absolutely take that deal. So this card is to be used politically, and we get extra value out of it because it has Death Touch, which is fantastic. Tadias, Juniper Ascendant, is a 4-mana 1/3 with Reach, and it says Tadias has hexproof unless it's attacking. So this counts for Kathril again. It has hexproof because it is not attacking while it is in the graveyard. Then it says whenever a creature you control with Reach attacks, untap it, and it can't be blocked by creatures with greater power this combat. So it gives Kathril pseudo-vigilance, assuming that it has a Reach, but it also, Tadias itself has Reach, so it gives kind of pseudo-vigilance to this creature as well. But then it says whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it can potentially draw us up to 3 cards per combat, which is awesome. And it can help us trigger off of Double Strike, assuming that Kathril has Double Strike. So that's just awesome as well. Toski, Bearer of Secrets, is a 4-mana 1/1. This spell can't be countered. It has Indestructible, which is key as well. It attacks each combat if able, and then whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So Toski's doing a lot of work here. It is indestructible, it is a body, and it will help us trigger off of any creature we control dealing combat damage to a player, notably if Kathril has Double Strike, or if any of our creatures have Double Strike and they manage to get through, then we'll be drawing more cards with Toski. So just a great card overall here. All right, let's go over our overruns then. How do we plan on closing out the game? Akroma Vision of Ixidor is a 7-mana 6/6 with Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Partner. And then at the beginning of each combat, until end of turn, each creature you control gets +1/+1. If it has Flying, First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Protection, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and Partner. So this will be powering up Kathril like no tomorrow, and it's a great creature card to put into our graveyard for all of those juicy keywords. So just a great option overall here. And yeah, Berserk is a 1 mana instant. This can be cast only before the combat damage step. Target creature gains trample and gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is its power. At the beginning of the next end step, destroy that creature if it attacked this turn. So Berserk is ran for 2 to 3 reasons. First, we can actually buff Kathril. So we're always assuming that Kathril has double strike, right? And so it will have at least 5 keywords on it, we'll say. So it'll be an 8/8 with double strike, right? So if we cast Berserk on Kathril, that is a surprise 1-hit KO if it's able to get through for all of that damage. What it can also be used for is to kill an opponent's creature and buff it while it is swinging at another opponent. So it won't help when that creature is going at our face, but if they have a old Gnawbone or something, well, that's probably a poor example because old Gnawbone triggers off of the number of combat damage being dealt. But let's take something like Worldspine Worm, right? They have Worldspine Worm, they attack for 15 damage. We're going to give that +X/+0 to potentially allow that worm to 1-hit KO our opponents, or maybe it's an 8/8 to deal an extra 8 damage, and then it gets rid of that creature for us as well. So it can double as a removal spell, and the other utility that this card has is that if we cast it on Kathril, it will then be destroyed, meaning that it will go back to the command zone, and we are happy to cast Kathril for 7 mana. The reason is that by the time we cast it for 7 mana, we have more keywords in our graveyard, and so it will enter as a more powerful version of itself, and potentially if we have creatures on board that we want to give keywords to help get through. So something like our Primeval Protector, for example, which is a vanilla 10/10, we want to be able to reapply all of those keywords to give it evasion. So happy to cast Kathril for 7 mana. And if we're holding an Eerie Ultimatum, for example, then we maybe can just put it in the graveyard for future reanimation style effects. So Berserk does a lot of work in this deck for only 1 mana. Earthshaker Giant, 6 mana, 6/6 with Trample, and when it ETBs, other creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain Trample until end of turn. So just a nice overrun effect here on a 6/6 Trample body. Elesh Norn is a 7 mana 4/7 vigilance. Other creatures you control get +2/+2, and creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. Now, Elesh Norn is run for a variety of reasons. First, it has vigilance, so we're just building in all of that soft synergy. It's a great overrun that typically I only assume that Elesh Norn will survive for 1 turn because I have never seen it survive more than 2 turns on a go around because it is just so oppressive for our opponents. But because the -2/-2 will basically nuke all of our token decks, or all of our opponents' token decks, all of our opponents' aristocrat style of decks. It gets rid of your Zilipore Cutthroats, your Blood Artists, your dumb little tokens that they're going to sack for whatever. And it gives us that overrun effect, which is a differential of +4/+4 if you add both of those together. So just a lot going on here, and we're happy to cast this for 7 mana. Or if it ends up in the graveyard, great, we've got Vigilance. Endray's Forerunners can be substituted with something like a Moonshaker Cavalry or a Lair of Behemoths if you want. I chose to run this instead. First, I'll read the card here. It's an 8 mana 7/7 with Vigilance, Trample, Haste. When it ETBs, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. Now, a Moonshaker Cavalry will buff our board for more total power. This is when it ETBs, creatures you control gain Flying and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. Typically, when we're ready to overrun at 8 mana, we have at least 5 creatures on board, so it will give our creatures like +5/+5 or something like that. The reason why we're not running it is because we already have flying pretty much covered in our keyword analysis. And so I just wanted to include something with more keywords. And Endray's Forerunners helps us to survive on the crackback by giving everything vigilance. So it is not the not as game ending as Moonshaker Cavalry. It is the more fair version of this effect that I would say, but it also has extra keywords as well. So we're just trying to, again, jam as many keywords as we can, create all of that soft synergy for a more powerful deck. But if you wanted to, you could sub this for Crater Hoof or Moonshaker Cavalry, and you would the deck would perform, arguably better. But we're just, we already have flying covered in our list of keywords here. Overwhelming Stampede is exactly what we want to be casting on turn 6, because until end of turn, creatures you control gain trample, get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Again, Cathril's going to be at minimum an 8/8, so this would give all of our creatures +8/+8, and on average we'll have about 4 creatures on board when we cast our Overwhelming Stampede after Kathril comes out. So we are going to be able to swing for at least 50 damage to then KO an opponent. Rumbleweed is a new card from Owls of Thunder Junction. It is an 11 mana 8/8, but it costs 1 less for each land card in your graveyard. It has Vigilance, Reach, and Trample, and when in ETBs, other creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain Trample until end of turn. So again, just a lot of synergy here. We've got 3 keywords on it. It can be flickered with the ETB, and on average, what I have noticed is that in goldfishing, I tend to have about 5 lands in the graveyard when I'm ready to cast Rumbleweed. Even more if we've managed to play like a Hermit, play like a Hermit Druid or Mesmeric Orb. So this, on average, I would say will cost probably about 6 mana, so that it's on par with something like the Earthshaker Giant. So just be aware that you want to be cracking your fetches and things like that to power up this cost reduction. Then we have Skyhunter Strike Force, which is a 3 mana 2/2 Cat Knight with flying and melee, and it gives Lieutenant, as long as you control your commander, other creatures you control have melee, which means that essentially if we're attacking all 3 opponents, all of our creatures, when they attack, get +3/+3. So that's a nice little buff, and it has flying, and it's just generally efficient for what it is doing. So Skyhunter Strike Force, not as game-ending as an Overwhelming Stampede, but for only 3 mana to give our creatures +3/+3, and it has the flying keyword, it's just a shoo-in for the deck. All right, let's cover our late game effects here, and then we'll cover our sort of miscellaneous effects. Within our Reanimate category, we are, of course, running Eerie Ultimatum, which is a 7 mana sorcery. Return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. This will return lands as well, so just be careful with casting this, because it will remove all of our creatures from the graveyard and if we want to cast Kathril. So this is really, when you want to cast this once Kathril's on the field. It has hexproof, something that we know Kathril's going to be sticking around because we can then get all of our creatures back and start beating face. Notably, also, it is quite color intensive, so just be careful to make sure that you are generating as many colors as you can. And yeah, the other side grade to Eerie Ultimatum is Ascend from Avernus, which is a similar effect, but it doesn't get everything back for the same cost. So that's an X white. Return all creature and planeswalker cards with mana value X or less from a graveyard to the battlefield, and then this spell gets exiled. So the problem here is that if we cast it for the same amount of mana as Eerie Ultimatum, we're only getting back creature cards with mana value 4 or less instead of all of our lands and pretty much all of our permanents, including enchantments, artifacts, things like that. And it's not a big deal, but this spell does exile itself, whereas Eerie Ultimatum we could theoretically get back with our Skullwinder. So, that's just a little nitpick there, but Eerie is definitely way more powerful and one of those just top decks that you are so glad to see on turn 7. Incarnation Technique is a 5 mana sorcery with Demonstrate, which means when you cast a spell, you may copy it. If you do choose an opponent to also copy it, mill 5 cards and return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is pulling essentially double duty. We get to mill, because we're always going to be demonstrating it, and we're going to be targeting whatever we think is the weakest player to get a creature back. So, like a Storm player or whoever's behind the most. But ultimately, for 5 mana, we get to mill 10 cards, and and then reanimate 2 creature cards. So if we have something like a Zatulpa and we don't really need it in the graveyard, we get this giant big fatty, or like an Elish Norn or an Earthshaker Giant or an Ochroma, so we can just get those giant creatures back. Or if we just need to generate some more card advantage, we can reanimate our Esper Sentinel or Bob or something like that. So just a lot of options there. And then Living Death functions as our only board wipe in the deck. Each player, for 5 mana, each player exiles all creature cards from his or graveyard, then sacks all creatures he or she controls, then puts all creatures he or she exiled this way onto the battlefield. So it essentially swaps your graveyard, swaps everybody's graveyard and their battlefield. And so this is great because, first of all, if we need to cast Kathril again, we are presumably all of the creatures on our battlefield are going to have keywords, and so we are still refilling our graveyard to have all of those keywords, and we can then reanimate all of our creatures. So that is pretty great. The only downside is that we are affecting our opponents as well, so any other graveyard decks at the table are going to take advantage of this. So just be careful in terms of when you cast this. Maybe you can cut a deal or something like that to say like, hey, like I can reanimate all your creatures. Can you not attack me or something like that? I don't know. Cut a deal, something like that. All right, and then we'll move on to our miscellaneous categories, I would say. So for our protection pieces, we are running Guardian of Faith, which is a 3-mana 3/2 with Flash and Vigilance when it ETBs. Any number of other target creatures you control phase out, which means treat them and anything attached to them as though they don't exist until their controller's next turn. The upgrade to this card is to run Teferi's Protection, and I will not pretend as if Guardian of Faith is better than Teferi's Protection. However, we are running Guardian of Faith again for that soft synergy. The reason is it's a creature, right? It can be reanimated. It has Vigilance, and we can flicker it because it's an ETB effect. So that is one of the reasons why we picked this over Teferi's Protection. And also I will say that Teferi's Protection, while it is amazing and is really just a staple in any deck is made better by including it. It's one of those kind of boring cards that people are tired of seeing. So here we have something that's more flavorful to the deck and more synergistic. Slippery Bogbonder is a 4-mana 3/3 with Flash and Hexproof. When it ETBs, put a Hexproof counter on target creature, then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. So this is doing triple duty, right? It has Hexproof, which is important for Kathril when it ETBs. It will save Kathril if it doesn't have Hexproof, that we can put a Hexproof counter on it at a later point in time. And it can also move counters at flash speed onto another creature. So let's say that we have a Primeval Protector on board and Kathril with a bunch of keywords, right? Somebody says, all right, we're going to cast, let's say Kathril doesn't have Hexproof. So we say, maybe it has, I don't know, like Double Strike, Lifelink Menace, right? Flying. But we know that there's a targeted removal spell on the stack targeting Kathril. Well, we can either give it Hexproof, or if we don't want Kathril for some reason, then we can actually just move all those counters onto another creature. For example, if we know that we need more power and toughness to sort of carry us over the finish line to finish off an opponent. So there's just a lot of stuff that this card is able to do. And it's just like it says in the title, it's just very slippery card. All right, let's move to our flicker category. So Ephemerate, just the best flicker card in Commander. Exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it has Rebound. Now, when this rebounds, we probably don't want to be casting it on Kathril because once it's already on the field, and doesn't have Summoning Sickness, we really want to be swinging with it. So just be careful. Like, you don't want this, like, choose the rebound copy carefully. And then we're also running another card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction here, Getaway Glamour, which is a 1-mana instant with Spree. Most of the time, we're going to be using the first ability here to pay a total of 2 mana. Exile target non-token creature, return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. Notably, we're choosing this for the end step ability so that Kathril can survive a board wipe. And then we can also use it as a removal spell in a pinch to pay a total of 3 mana, destroy target creature if no other creature has greater power. So it will destroy the most powerful creature on board. Now, I will say that this has a little bit of anti-synergy with Kathril. If Kathril enters with 5 or 6 counters, it's probably going to be the most or the highest power creature on board. So it's not likely to be this probably won't be able to target an opponent's creature, which has greater power. So most of the time, I would say 80% of the time, we're going to be running this for the flicker effect. But if we happen to have our opponents have really scary creature, like something that they've pumped to insane proportions, like if you're facing like a Xenagos player that can pump stuff like No Tomorrow, or somebody else has used an Overwhelming Stampede or Creative Behemoth or something like that, then this can be helpful, and it can also be cast for both modes if you need to use both modes. So just a great modal spell there as well. And then finally, we move on to the one pet card in the deck. This could potentially be replaced. Well, actually, you could argue that this could be replaced with something like a Hunted Horror, for example, if you cut like a political deal. And actually, maybe I'll actually include Hunted Horror over Primeval Protector just because it has the trample keyword. However, what Primeval Protector can do, so first of all, let me read it. It's an 11 mana, 10/10. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature your opponents control, and when it ETBs, put a +1/+1 counter on each other creature you control. So this buffs Kathril by a tiny little bit. And notably, why we're running it is that if once this is on the field and then we cast Kathril, we can give this evasion, so something like trample, something like that, to then give ourselves a trample 10/10. You can maybe even replace this with like a Galta. This spell costs X less gas, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it has trample, actually. Maybe I'm just going to sub in Galta, because the general play pattern, I think, would be that we cast Kathril on turn 5, and then, I mean, the Galta will give us the trample keyword and more stats, and if Kathril is like we'll call it a 8/8, right? Then Galta would cost 4 mana in total, so 4 mana for a trample 12/12. Maybe we'll actually do that. I think I'm actually going to switch that out on the fly, because I'm thinking, so Primeval Protector, right? If you consider, okay, how many creatures do we anticipate our opponents to have at the time that we cast this? And I think on average we can assume that there will be 9 creatures on board, if you assume that each opponent probably has like 3 creatures. If you have like a storm player who doesn't have many creatures, but typically everybody will have their commander, right? And then it's probably not unreasonable for your opponents to have two more creatures each. So I think realistically you could cast this for 1 mana. So really your options would be like, okay, if you want to increase the mana here by 1, you could run a Hunted Horror, but it only has a 7/7 body, while giving out those 2/3 green centaurs. The thing is, with the green centaurs, you can actually run this politically to basically say like, hey, like you you over there, player who's behind, I'm going to give you this 6 power worth of creatures, and in order to select you as receiving these creatures, you need to attack the other player for at least 2 turns or something like that. And so this creates essentially 13 power in your service for not that much mana. So I think maybe, the question is, do you run Hunted Horror or do you run Galta? And I think you honestly run Hunted Horror because it gives that trample keyword. So we're gonna actually sub this out. We're gonna make an on-the-fly adjustment here. All right, and with that, we are actually getting better by the minute with this deck tech here, folks. So Hunted Horror in, Primeval Protector out, now that I think about it, and giving us more keywords. Now, lastly, I'll just touch on the mana base here before we wrap. Aghanim the Undercrypt is going to be just another mass reanimate effect that we want to hold off casting as much as possible. And this is great because we're running all 3 bounce lands in our colors. So theoretically, if we have Aghanim on the field, we could return that back to our hand with the bounce lands so that we can cast this as a spell later. But this will absolutely save your bacon in the late game and is just a great top deck. Ancient Ziggurat, Again, we're running 50 creatures, so this is going to add 1 mana of any color for essentially 90% of our deck's spells. So just a great option here for creature-heavy decks. Boseiju can help us destroy artifacts, enchantments, or non-basic lands in a pinch. Let's see, nothing else is worthy here. Dakmor Salvage, if it ends up in the graveyard, we have a dredge trigger, which is noteworthy because we just want to be milling as much as possible in the early game, so it can help us to essentially get us resources back to our hand and then be milling along the way. Eagles of the North is in a land slot because we can plain cycle it for 1, which means it's essentially a tapped land, and it has flying, and it has an ETB, which can be flickered to give our creatures +1/+0 and first strike, which is awesome. Fabled Passage is going to send a land to our graveyard to reduce the cost of Rumbleweed. Gallifrey Council Chamber will ETB Surveil 1, and it taps for colorless, and then we can technically add 1 mana of any color to cast a Time Lord, but that's not really relevant because we don't have any Time Lords. Generous Ent is a 6 mana 5/7 with reach, so an extra keyword. When ETBs create a food token, so a little bit of incidental life gain, but most of the time we're going to be cycling this and sending it to the graveyard, which is exactly where we want this card to be. Let's see, a bounce land here into the Triumph is going to help us tap for all colors. Another Surveillant, we're running all 3 Surveil lands. We're also running 1 Mana Confluence. Technically, you could run City of Brass and Mana Confluence. However, I tend to run only 1 of these pain lands that will trigger off of every tap, just because the life loss can be too much with 2 of those on the field. With our fetch lands, again, we can be searching for the Surveil lands, so this can be cracked to search for a tapped Surveil land to help fill our graveyard. And then we've got more bounce lands, etc., etc. Reflecting Pool, more bounce lands, more Surveil lands, and then I think that's all. So we have a couple of filter lands here, which again, I personally, in my own personal deck list in paper, will have proxied OG duels in place of, let's see, Wooded Bastion, Twilight Mire, and Vault of Champions. I would sub these out for OG duels of their respective colors, just because I like to be able to search for those to be untapped if needed without the life loss from the shock lands. So yeah, that is going to be the mana base, and with that, I would like to conclude the video. So thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it. Always appreciate it, and it helps me with the YouTube algorithm. And feel free to subscribe if you like this type of content. I produce content like this on the regular. And with that, we will see you all in the next video. Check out that companion video, which will be a goldfish of 2 or 3 playthroughs of this deck to see how it functions. And with that, I would like to say goodbye, y'all. Have a good one.